Maybe that'll help. Hi, y'all. We are doing a really good job. You are doing excellent work in coming up with the questions and the kind of format that you need, and it's just giving you the opportunity to think through all the different types of questions that you could ask with regard to your topic, so that you can choose from among those. You've done a bunch of questions, but now you're going to narrow it down to one or two. And with those one or two, if you were to choose a quantitative study, what would that study look like? Well, you're going to choose, like I said, one or two of those, and you're going to go through a process of filling out a worksheet that will help you think through what that means. And I am going to show you the worksheet and talk you through an example of what I mean by each part of the worksheet. So let me share the screen, and I will walk you through how you're going to do this. But the most important thing is that you're choosing the question that makes sense to you. So I will talk about that as we begin here. All right, so right now you should see my worksheet. And the first question on there is, what's the purpose of a study? This is not a question. The purpose of my study is I'm worried about effective professional development for student achievement, and I'm particularly concerned about our PLCs in my school district, and they're not all working the way they should be. So that's what I put it as my purpose, because that's what it is. It's your very practical, in your context, what you're concerned about. Frameworks. Now, we haven't really talked much about frameworks, and it's in the reading, and there's going to be a lot of more emphasis with your chair in choosing a framework, but I'll explain mine in this context. A theoretical framework is a way of looking at your data, a way of looking at your questions, a way of looking at the assessing. It's not your list. The conceptual framework I have, that conceptual, that's the second one, is the best practices of PLCs. That conceptual framework usually just comes from doing a really great lit review. And it'll give you a list of things that you need to be concerned about, and that will inform your IVs and DVs and whatnot. But your theoretical framework doesn't tell you what to look at, it tells you how to look at it. So in this case, yes, everybody knows there's literature on what are the best practices for a professional learning community. Well, what's the most productive way to think about professional learning communities? That is as communities of practice. Community of practice is a theory, a way of looking at groups that you want to be communities, and looking at what are their practices, what do they think about. So I said a PLC is always a community. So even if it's not the kind of community that's effective at encouraging growth, so a community of practice framework tells us what we need to consider, that we need to consider multiple elements of the community, like the use of language, the values, the practices, the reifications of the processes, which could be anything from documents to forms to fill out to reports of committee work, or whatever the case may be. So the communities of practice framework is a way of looking at things. One of the more popular frameworks in this doctoral program, a lot of people use Maslow's hierarchy. A lot of people use constructivism or sociocultural theories as ways of thinking about the things that you get from the lit review. So it frames the way you think about the list of items that you're studying. Okay, so with communities of practice, I'm still looking at best practices, and I'm just going to describe everything in the language of communities of practice. So here is the question, and I've said only one per worksheet. If you have a simple question, you really ought to have 2 or 3 questions to have a full dissertation size study. Okay. In my case, I'm going to ask one complicated question, and that is, are there significant differences between pre-intervention scores in the 3 major areas of PLC best practices and the post-assessment scores? So I'm going to use a tool to measure aspects of professional learning communities that are best practices. And I'm going to look at pre and post. Now, I've slightly complicated that, and I'll get to that in a minute. I may have to fix something. I'll go back in a second and check. Let's see. My hypothesis is that there are significant differences between the pre-scores and the post-scores. I used a lot of words to say that, but that's what I mean. The null hypothesis is that there are not significant differences. I would love to say there's a significant increase, but I'm well aware that there could be a significant decrease. That sometimes happens. Things backfire on you sometimes. So you got to leave that open for possibility. So there's just significant differences, or there's no difference after my intervention. And so the next thing on the list is definitions of key terms. In my case, it happens to be collegiality. What's it mean to be student-centered, data-driven? Oh, look, I didn't finish typing it all out. Okay, well, fill in, and here's my references for the ones that I intended to use. So just make sure you fill in the blanks with the definitions that other people have come up with. This is not going to be your definition. This is going to be a definition that is word for word from a source that you have read. Okay. That way, everybody reading your study will know what you mean when you say those things. All right, so the next thing, number 6, is identify and classify your variables. Now, here we go. Pre and post is my independent variable. It's the thing that I want to do something, to change something and see if it made a difference. So I'm using one group or one set of groups and looking at pre and post scores. Now, the areas that are being measured in pre and post are my dependent variables, the things that I'm hoping collegiality goes up. I'm aware that it could go down. And the other things include student-centeredness, data-driven, and just an overall score, adding up all of those things. So those are my dependent variables. I've classified them, and on this form, I give you what page number to look at that to see and make sure you're classifying them appropriately. And the last thing, so I've got one independent variable, 4 dependent variables, and I've got this other one. The fidelity of implementation. When you're doing an implementation of any kind of program, you want to know, well, how well was this process done? And so I'm not just measuring the outcomes. I am looking at how they adhered to the rules that set forth from the very beginning, and some groups are following them and some groups are like doing whatever they want and doing their own thing, just going in and lesson planning, and I want to measure the degree to which they're even trying PLCs, which is different than those other categories. So I had to give that, and I will, I say interval. But that sounds really more categorical, doesn't it? I'm going to put them in groups like beginning, intermediate, and advanced. So I'll call those categorical. I guess it could have been interval. Instrumentation. How am I going to measure all of these things? Well, pre or post is not something you measure. You just know that the scores are either from the pre-assessment or the post-assessment. So that variable is pretty easy. It's just sort of defined by the circumstances. My 4 dependent variables, I'm using the PLC assessment protocol that was published by Angel in 2010. And it's my reference for both the validity and the reliability, which is the third and fourth blank for each one. So I just repeated that over and over because they're all from the same study, because it's all from the same tool. And here's the problem. I'm using something that's been established. If you're creating your own measurement tool, then you have to do your own study of validity and reliability. You'll have to do a pilot study using your survey, or a pilot study using your rubric, or whatever it is, and you will have to. And that's something that it's covered in the book, and we will negotiate with myself and your chair about how to do that. But you'll have to say it will be, if you're not using someone else's instrument to measure, then you're going to have to say, I'm going to define it in the study, and I will do a pilot study to prove that. You'd have to write that in the third and fourth blanks if you're going to do that yourself. You can't just make up a rubric and use it without testing it out. So make sure you address that. It's either done before, which is all of my cases. And then here's my last one, which is not Angel, but this one's the fidelity of implementation rubric, and that is also done in a previous study, in this case, ALSPA 2008. And so I'm using a bunch of tools that already have validity and reliability, and it makes my study easy. I'm just using them in my context, which makes it a different study. So, proposed statistical test. I'm going to use a Mancova. Sounds great with that. A multivariable analysis of covariance. What's that mean? It means that I've got one categorical IV, which is pre and post. I've got 4 dependent variables. Anything more than one, it puts it in the M, puts the M on the Mancova. And then one control variable, where I'm taking out the effect of how they tried to, whether they are trying, I guess, the effort in adhering to principles. Okay, so the next section is test assumptions. Every time you have a test, whether it's t-test, an ANOVA, a Mancova, a Pearson R correlation, or a chi-square, there's things that you have to check before you know whether those are valid tools. And these are just rules that are out there. So you need to list the assumptions and how to check. Well, how did I find the assumptions for Mancova? Listen carefully. I went to Google and I said, assumptions for Mancova. And the very first thing that popped up is this reference right here, that link. And it talks about the assumptions, and then it lists the tests that you use to check those assumptions. So you're not recreating the wheel. You should not be creating anything for this. You should be just simply going to the internet and saying, okay, if I'm using a dependent t-test, what are the assumptions of a dependent t-test? And then list them and how you measure them. Now, when I come to doing this study, and I know people are scared to death, and Mancoba sounds really scary, and wow, what calculations do you have to do? I'm not going to do any, and I'm not going to do any of these tests. I'm going to go into SPSS or an advanced Excel spreadsheet or some program, and I'm going to put my data for my variables in columns, and I'm going to use the protocol for that program to run a Mancoba. And when I run the Mancoba, it's going to output some answers, some statistics, because it just does the work. And usually on another tab on the same spreadsheet, it will pop up and in most cases, it pops up all of these tests. It'll give you the Levine's test for covariance, and it'll give you the box test and all the other appropriate tests that just to double check that this ANCOVA really worked the way it was supposed to. So you do not come up with this. You do not have to have anything memorized. You just look it up, paste it in, and when you do the study, you'll double check that all those things got done in the program and verify that Mancoba was appropriate, or whatever test you're using is appropriate based on those things. So it's important, but at the same time, you don't have to do them. You just have to interpret the results. Once you put your variables in the right column and click the right button to run all these things. So that's how you fill out that part of the form, number 9. Now we're on to number 10, which is identify the population. You want to generalize your findings. Who you're trying to prove this for, what group? Well, when I get results, good, bad, or indifferent, I'm going to be reporting about or generalizing it to any kind of professional learning community that might be in an Appalachian rural school district. Now, why? Well, I can't do it to just any school district because it wouldn't match up. It may be a very different culture in urban schools versus rural schools, and it may be very different in Western United States as opposed to Appalachia. So I'm not claiming anything beyond Appalachia. But my convenience sample, which is my method, is going to be the 2 school districts near me. It's going to be a total of about 20 PLCs from a bunch of schools within those 2 districts. And I know this is representative of the Appalachian region because I look at the demographics and I can show you that it's approximately the same kind of percent in terms of diversity and SES and gender and all the basic variables that you would look at to see if you're representative. Okay, so that's how I know it's representative. It's typical of the Appalachian region. And the next column says what will be your N. Well, the N is 20. Now, I put down here because it's 20 PLCs that I'm analyzing. So each PLC is going to have a set of scores. There's the complicated thing is that you may think, well, there's about 100 teachers in those PLCs. So is your N 100 or is it 20? Well, I'm analyzing data from the PLC level. So the N is 20, which is kind of small on the small end for a quantitative study. But it is what it is, and it would be hard to collect more than that. So it's already going to be difficult enough. It's dissertation size to analyze 20 PLCs. What confounding variables will you control for via sampling? Well, I am controlling for my confounding variable, which is the fidelity of an implementation. I'm accounting for that in the analysis by doing a covariate in my Mancoba. If I didn't have it in the analysis, then I would have to use a sampling method that removes that I would only look at ones that were truly trying to implement PLC in the way it was intended. So that would be, so I could do it in sampling, but I chose to include all of the levels of fidelity. And so I did not control for it in sampling, I controlled for it in the analysis. So I just said none. All right, number 11. What are the delimitations and limitations of the study that affect its trustworthiness? Okay. Talked about sampling. When I chose just rural Appalachian schools, I limited my generalization to rural Appalachian schools. That delimits, that takes all the possibilities and narrows it down. When you choose something in your method, narrows down where you can generalize, that's a delimitation. A limitation is a possible thing that could lead to error or misinterpretation. In this case, it's inter-rater reliability, because I can't go in and do the full assessment on all 20 schools myself. I'm going to get help, which means we've got to do cross-training, and that's inter-rater reliability is a really important aspect that is always, whenever you have more than one person doing the evaluating, you will wonder how well their evaluations would have matched up. If I had gone to that school instead of my friend Teresa going to that school, would I have scored them the same? So we'll do a training to try to eliminate or at least reduce the amount of differences we would have had. But I've got a limit. I've got to list that as a limit on this study. All right, and then another part. I wanted to not just limit or talk about the limitations, but also strengths. And I've included the fact that I used a well-researched instrument as one of the great strengths of this study. The validity and reliability are unquestioned, and these are commonly used instruments, and that brings a lot of strength and trustworthiness. The last thing is not work. It's just a note on how you can access Excel for free. If you haven't downloaded it from Carson Newman's account with Microsoft, there's instructions here in how to load the analysis tool pack and make sure that you've got all the tools that you would need. That's just one option. Some people buy SPSS, or the student version of SPSS, and some people have access to a statistical analysis tool like that in their school district. However you want to handle it, that's an individual choice. That's on you. What I help with is the decision making before and the interpretation after. And you will run those statistics, but I just wanted to include that so that you know that in most cases you don't have to pay for an analysis tool. You actually have access to one already. So this was the long-winded explanation using my example. Your example is going to be one of the research questions that you pick as a possibility for your dissertation. You've looked at several questions, so pick one if it's complicated, two if they're simple, because this needs to be dissertation size. Mine's a Mann-Cova. I looked at covariance and I looked at multiple IVs, so that's definitely complicated enough. But at the same time, it's doable in a year, so that's an important aspect too. So fill out the worksheet and upload it into the discussion board for the quantitative worksheet. And the reason I'm having you upload it into a discussion board is so that everyone can look at everyone else's work and learn. We are a sharing community. Teachers share. We work in groups all the time. We beg, steal, and borrow. So just like everything else, somebody's got to be brave and put the first one or two out there, and everybody else will follow suit and check each other's work. As iron sharpens iron, so one doc student will help another by looking at and learning from each other. So do that, and as always, I'm available to answer questions. And yes, you are panicked, and yes, you are narrowing your dissertation ideas in this one. But this is only the first checkpoint. We've just finished quantitative. As we finish this assignment, we finish the quantitative part and we move on to qualitative. And at the end of the course is where you actually choose between those two. So you may or may not go with the thing that's your worksheet. But you're getting more and more narrow in your focus, and you're informing your lens. So it's going to be helpful whether you roll with this one for your dissertation or you end up using the qualitative one that we do the same kind of work with. All right, enough said. You're doing great work, and I am going to post a sign-up sheet for some individual talks in the next 24 hours. I will get that started. So have a great day, and I'll see you online.